Good morning. This is the 12th lesson in a series on Isaiah. We got one more lesson next week. And today's lesson, Isaiah reveals to the nation of Israel God's disdain for hypocrisy. You know, in today's times, you turn on the news and you see where the leaders today are telling us all what we should do by doing things themselves totally different. The governor of California says you can't eat in small groups or more than 5 and don't fellowship or go inside with people. And within the week, he's photographed eating at a big restaurant, fancy restaurant with political advisors and lobbyists in a very fancy restaurant. Of course, he comes out and apologizes. I don't know if he's apologizing for getting caught or apologizing for his action. Of course, the Speaker of the House gets caught while saying you can't go outside and do these things with an unmasked meeting in her hair salon, which she shut down, but she opens just for herself to have her hair done. This week in New Jersey, a city commissioner who wants to shut down outdoor dining within hours of that news conference goes out to outdoor dining himself and gets caught. And you can go to a political rally and be next to each other and it's quite all right, or a riot, but you can't have church and sit 6 feet apart without a mask on. It's the hypocrisy that gets the most under our skin. You know, there's a saying that I have that I'm sure it's not original, but I don't know where it came from. But I always find that consistency is the proof of legitimacy. If you have a legitimate point, it will be consistent throughout your life. If you have a consistent position, then it will be a legitimate position, and you measure everything by it. When you're inconsistent with your actions, then people fail to see any point or principle in your life. You must be consistent or be a hypocrite. God can't stand it. As we go back and review chapters 58, 59, and 60 in Isaiah for prior to today's lesson, you find that the nation of Israel is out of order. They're out of proper format. As a matter of fact, in 59:4, that word chaos there is the original Greek word is, or Hebrew word really is tohu. And it's the same word used in Genesis 1:2. Before the earth was made, it was said it was void, it was empty. The literal translation from tohu is empty. There's nothing there. It's without substance. And so there's where the nation of Israel was. They really had no true worship. They were in chaos. They were without form or order whatsoever. As a matter of fact, Isaiah, in the verses in 58 and 59 and 12 and chapter 12, is really the inspiration for Paul in Ephesians, where he talks about putting on the full armor of God. Because order will come when God puts on his armor and sets it right. And he sets order in place. And so when Paul told us in Ephesians 6:14 through 17, the armor of God, he was telling us to put on the righteousness that was given to us so that we might stand in this world that we're at. Because we cannot stand in this world without the protections that God has for us. And those protections come in proper worship, not in rituals and things that we do expecting in return. That type of activity is carnal, and it's really pagan in its origin. The pagans would sacrifice for return. They'd make a deal with their gods. We'll sacrifice and we'll slaughter innocent people so that you may reward us in battle or give us a crop. And so they would make sacrifices to the various gods of the universe for fertility, for good crops, for a victory in battle, and they were always dealing with their gods. And so our God doesn't like a deal. He's not going to trade us a return for some ritual that we perform. And as we read today, we found that Israel was in that ritualistic form of routine in their worship. And so in the first 5 verses of today's chapter 58, we find some of that ritual. This is the ritual that preempted the destruction of Israel and their captivity. And so it goes back for a while. And so we start reading the first 5 verses, and it says, "Cry aloud, spare not, lift up thy voice like a trumpet, and show my people their transgressions, and the house of Jacob their sins. Yet they seek me daily, and delight to know my ways, as a nation that did righteousness, and forsook not the ordinance of their God. And they ask me of ordinances of justice, and they take delight in approaching to God." Now, it seems like verses 1 and 2 contradict each other. The first thing in verse 1, it says, "Cry aloud, Isaiah, spare not, lift up thy voice like a trumpet," or that word trumpet is really from the word shofar. And a shofar was a ram's horn that was modeled into a horn that was given to gain attention or to sound alarm. And that's what they used those for. If there was a battle or something needed attention, they would sound the shofar. And everybody knew that something of importance was about to happen. Then they would get instructions. I was in the Navy for 23 years. We used bells and whistles and horns and claxtons and gongs to bring our attention. There was a little ding ding, and that usually caused you to set up. And usually after that ding ding, there was a following announcement. Like the coming and going of the commanding officer of the ship, or routine announcements, ding ding. On a submarine, they had a claxton that we rang when we dove or surfaced the ship. And there was also gongs, which were emergency gongs or battle station gongs. And when you heard them, you got up and went. And then later on, it would tell you what the emergency was. But as God told Isaiah here, lift up thy voice like a trumpet for what? Attention and warning. And show my people their transgressions, the house of Israel their sins. Then it looks like it complicates. It says, "Yet they seek me daily, and they delight to know my ways, as if a nation that did righteousness and forsake the ordinances of their God. And they seek me at the ordinances of Jerusalem." This is not, verse 2, a true representative of what God thought they were doing. No. If you read it in there, you'll see what he's talking about, because it's really tongue-in-cheek. "Yet they seek me daily." Oh, they were in ritualistic practice. "And delight to know my ways, as a nation." See that word "as a"? That means like a nation. In other words, it's not true. They were faking it. "That did righteousness, and forsook not the ordinances of their God. They ask of me the ordinances of justice. They take delight in approaching to God." Oh, they loved their religion. They would do what they were supposed to do. They would perform their little rituals because they thought they would get something out of it. And you see that in verse 3. "Wherefore have we fasted?" Why do we fast? They say, "And thou seekest not. Wherefore have we afflicted our soul, and thou takest no knowledge? Behold, in the day of your fast ye find pleasure, and exact all your labors." He said, no, you're doing fasting, and you're suffering for a return, or to show how religious you are. Your ordinances are not based in truth. They're based in ritual or return. They want something back. It's almost like the mafia. When you see these mafia movies, they want to go to church when they baptize children or have a baby or someone dies, but their practices are vile, and they murder and they kill and they rob and they violate every righteous rule, but they're there in church doing their rituals to make up for it. They get in a little booth and they say, "Hail Mary, for I have sinned. Forgive me, Father." No. Those rituals mean nothing to God. As a matter of fact, they infuriate him because of the hypocrisy. They're just like we get upset when we see people that want to condemn our religious services. At the same time, they want to excuse rioters and political gatherings. The hypocrisy is a stink in the nostrils of God. And it says, you're doing all this stuff. Behold, in the day of your fast, ye find pleasure and exact all your labors. Exact all your labors, that translates really oppress the people that work for you. He says, you're a religious people, but the people in your own service, you oppress them. You may deny a meal or two, but you oppress the poor and the needy. And that's what you're doing. You know, these rituals mean nothing. I've spoken of it before, but like we'll go to a church wedding sometime in certain religions, and they will mix in the wedding a communion where everybody gets up and takes a wafer. And my wife and I, we never participate in that. And I've been asked before, they say, Jim, we know you're a Christian. Why did you not take the communion? And I just tell them, I said, you know, I just don't really want to participate in that ritual. And he said, well, do you take it in your church? Yes, I do. Why? Because it is not a ritual there. It is performed out of biblical instruction. The Lord's Supper is to be taken by people who are Christians, and they're to be taken after they examine their soul and to reestablish, like the preacher preached last week, or 2 weeks ago, on the fellowship a Christian has with their God. When I go to a wedding and I see people that I know that don't know the Lord, and they're participating in a ritual just because it's required of the wedding planners, that is a foul smell in the nostrils of God. And that's just my position. Do not do things simply because they're ritualistic. Now, there are times where you do not participate in things that are ritualistic, that by their very actions are an affront to God. And even though they may seem religious, they are not a true form of worship. And that is what he's talking about the nation of Israel as a whole. He says in verse 4, behold, ye fast for strife and debate, and smite with thy fist the wickedness. You shall not fast as you do this day to make your voice to be heard on high. He said, you're fasting, and then you are angry, and you fight, and you debate, and you argue. This is not the attitude of a worshipful people. The whole idea of worship being a personal relationship with the God was foreign to these people. They were ritualistic. They were as bad as the pagans, expecting to do religious things and get returns. I've even heard Christians say, well, you tithe for profit. What do you mean? Well, if you tithe, God will give you more money. First off is, tithing really was, anyway, I won't go into that, but the whole idea of you giving to get is exactly what God's talking that he hates about here. You don't give to get. You tithe and you give as God has blessed you as a form of worship. You should not make a big show of it. I went to years ago, 30, 40 years ago, one of the Christian colleges had a big rally for money downtown, and they had these stickers that if you gave a certain amount, you was able to wear on your lapel. Imagine that. I give, and so that I can wear something that shows that I give a certain amount. What a hypocrisy. What a hypocrisy. Now, if you want to give to a secular college because you support their football team, that's fine. But don't make it part of your worship. That has nothing to do with that. Is it a fact that I have chosen a day for a man to afflict his soul? It is to bow down his head as a bulrush and to spread sackcloth and ashes for him. Wilt thou call this a fast and an acceptable day to the Lord? He said, just because you do these things openly so people can think you're pious doesn't mean it's accepted by me. No. Motives matter in worship. Motives matter in worship. How and what you give. You know, last week we were able to send out the little Christmas shoe boxes, and I know that people, when they get those boxes and they want to give something for that young person anonymously, they don't know who it came from. They know a person who calls himself a follower of Christ gave me something, so that Christ gets the glory, not the person who sent it. That's why you don't sign your name to it. And when people go out and they're able to shop and get something in there, so that when that young person opens that box up and they think highly of God, that's worship. That's an activity that is worthy, because the glory is given to God, not to individuals. Is it not the fast that I have chosen? To loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, that you break every yoke? He said, let me tell you what. You want to fast for me? He said, take burdens off of your fellow person. When you see someone in need, help them. Take the yoke off of them. Loose every band. Set the captive free. God said, if you're a Christian, if you're my people, let the people that you oppress go free. Let there be liberty in the house of God. Let there not be a stratification of people based upon how they serve, where there's a hierarchy of importance. Let that be gone in the house of Israel. Is it not to deal bread to the hungry, that thou bringest the poor and cast out thy house? When thou seest the naked, that thou cover him, and that thou hide not thyself from thine own flesh. He said, you have people in need. Now, the last part of that's important. He said, what? Hide not yourself from who? Thy own flesh. Speaking to the nation of Israel. Israel should take care of the nation of Israel, because Israel were known as the people of the one God. And so when they see any Israelite in pain or suffering or bondage, they say, well, they must not have a good God. The same with the church today. The church's role is not to feed the world, but the church's role is to show the compassion of God to the world. And through that, there might be food. But above all things, let not the people of God go hungry in our house. Let not there be people in our congregation who we call brother and sister, go with need. That is a great and horrible travesty if members of our church cannot count on each other and the family of God for their needs. First and foremost, before we do anything, make sure that our testimony throughout this community in Goose Creek is that we take care of our own. So that what? And let not do not hide thyself from thine own people. Now, verses 8, 9, and 10 is an interesting text. Here it talks about conditions, and I want you to pick up on two words. One of those words is then, and the other one is if. Because these infer a condition for blessing. This is called a conditional covenant. Some covenants or agreements of God are unconditional. His salvation is unconditional. Once a Christian is saved, they cannot do anything to lose their salvation, but they can do a lot to lose their peace and their fellowship. That's why that baptism, which symbolizes our salvation, is done how many times? Once. But the Lord's Supper, which symbolizes our fellowship with God, is done multiple times, because our fellowship gets broken. And we have to restore fellowship. How? Through examining ourselves and repenting of our sins and reestablishing that personal relationship with our God. That's what the Lord's Supper emulates. And that's why when we have it, it's time to confess our sins and reestablish the personal relationship. Do not participate in the Lord's Supper like it's some type of ritual that you have to do. You miss the whole point. Verse 8, then shall thy light break forth as the morning. Then, what's that mean? After you have met the requirements of the prior verses. As the morning, and thy health shall spring forth speedily, and thy righteousness shall go before thee, and the glory of the Lord shall be thy rearward. Rearward means rear guard. It truly talks about the glory of the Lord shall cover you and protect you from attack from the rear. Then shall thou call, and the Lord shall answer. So your prayers being answers is conditional on how you worship. Then shall I cry and shall say, Here am I. If, there's a condition, if thou take away from the midst of thee the yoke, the putting forth of the finger, and the speaking of vanity. Your attitude will determine your effective prayer life. Also, how you treat others. If there's one thing we have to remember, if we focus on other people instead of ourselves and our needs and our pleasures and our peace, if we start to bring some relief to other people, you will be taken care of. When we focus on our needs and our pain and our hurt and our sufferings, we're not doing anything for other people. It's a selfish concern. So if you put things on others, if you focus on pure religion, God will hear and answer your prayer and meet your needs. And the Lord shall guide thee continually and satisfy thy soul in drought. Let me tell you something. There are times when you go through spiritual drought. All of us do. You wonder if God, the heavens are as brass, and you wonder if your prayers are being heard. But if we focus on others, our spiritual drought will come to an end. It's about other people. And he will satisfy our soul in drought and make fat thy bones, and thou shalt be like a watered garden and like a spring of water whose waters fail not. We need to be that garden. We need to be that person, fed by a spring of water that doesn't stop. And that's the Spirit of God. And they that shall be of thee shall build the old waste places. Thou shalt raise up thy foundations of many generations, and thou shalt be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of paths to dwell in. Now this has reference also to the restoration of the temple later on, after their exile. But it also has to do with the restoration of their spiritual well-being. And Christian, I'm going to tell you, we all need restoration. The nation of Israel never ceases to be the called people of God, but they need to be restored from time to time, and they're broken down and torn down. And God, and through Isaiah, tells us here, one of the paths for restoration is focusing on other people, what they need, their bondages, their afflictions, their needs. And God then will rebuild us and our foundation. God bless you.